Hello there. Today, we will explore the World War I, which was one of the deadliest conflicts in history, resulting in an estimated 10 million military dead and more than 20 million wounded. If you want to listen exclusive audiobooks and documentaries, you can join us on Patreon. Its link is given in the description, and do subscribe our channel. Europe, in the summer of 1914, was a continent on edge. The air was thick with tension, not the kind you could ignore, but the kind that made people glance nervously at newspapers, whisper in cafes, and wonder if the next diplomatic crisis would finally be the one that tipped everything into chaos. Nations were tangled in a web of alliances, armies were growing larger, and generals were drawing up war plans like they were preparing for an inevitable storm. And then, on a sunny June morning in Sarajevo, a single gunshot changed everything. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, wasn't exactly a beloved figure. His uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, had ruled for decades. But the empire was a patchwork of different peoples: Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, all held together by sheer force of tradition and bureaucracy. Franz Ferdinand had ideas about reforming the empire, but many saw him as cold and arrogant. Still, his visit to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, recently annexed by Austria-Hungary, was supposed to be a routine military inspection. The problem? Bosnia was home to many ethnic Serbs who resented Austro-Hungarian rule. Some of them, radical nationalists, saw Franz Ferdinand as a symbol of oppression. A secret society called the Black Hand, backed by elements within Serbia's military, had even trained a group of young men to assassinate him. On the morning of June 28th, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie arrived in Sarajevo by train. The city was buzzing, some with excitement, others with anger. The royal couple rode in an open car, waving at crowds, completely unaware that 6 assassins were scattered along their route. The first would-be killer lost his nerve, the second threw a bomb, but it bounced off the car and exploded behind them, injuring some bystanders. Franz Ferdinand, shaken but unharmed, decided to continue the tour. The other assassins, scattered at different points, failed to act. Except for one. Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, had been part of the conspiracy but had given up after the earlier failures. By sheer luck, or terrible fate, Franz Ferdinand's driver took a wrong turn and stalled right in front of the cafe where Princip was sulking. Before anyone could react, Princip stepped forward, pulled out a pistol, and fired 2 shots. One hit Sophie in the abdomen. The other struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. At first, no one seemed to realize how serious it was. The Archduke, bleeding heavily, muttered, "It's nothing," before slumping over. Sophie died almost instantly. Franz Ferdinand passed minutes later. The car sped away, leaving a stunned crowd behind. Princip, knowing he wouldn't escape, swallowed cyanide, but it was old and only made him vomit. He was arrested on the spot. News of the assassination spread like wildfire. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph was devastated, not just by the death of his nephew, but by the fear of what came next. Austria-Hungary had been looking for an excuse to crush Serbian nationalism, and now they had one. The domino effect begins. Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so harsh that no sovereign nation could accept them all. Serbia, knowing it couldn't win alone, turned to its ally, Russia. When Serbia's reply didn't fully satisfy Austria-Hungary, war was declared on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination. Now, the alliances kicked in. Russia, bound by treaty to protect Serbia, began mobilizing its army. Germany, Austria-Hungary's closest ally, saw this as a threat and declared war on Russia on August 1st. Then, because Germany had a plan to avoid a two-front war, the Schlieffen Plan, they also declared war on France, Russia's ally, on August 3rd. But here's where things got messy. To attack France quickly, Germany needed to go through Belgium, a neutral country. When German troops crossed the border on August 4th, Britain, which had promised to protect Belgium's neutrality, had no choice but to declare war on Germany. The world takes sides. In just a matter of weeks, what had started as a regional conflict in the Balkans had exploded into a full-blown world war. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, faced off against the Allies, France, Britain, Russia, and eventually Italy, Japan, and the United States. People everywhere were swept up in a mix of fear, patriotism, and confusion. Young men rushed to enlist, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. Newspapers painted the enemy as monsters. Leaders promised victory, but none of them truly understood the horror that was coming. Why did this happen? Looking back, it's easy to see how one assassination led to war, but the truth is, Europe had been a ticking time bomb for years. Nationalism, militarism, and tangled alliances had created a situation where even a small spark could set everything off. Franz Ferdinand's death was that spark. Some historians argue that if just one country had hesitated, if Germany hadn't pushed Austria-Hungary to be aggressive, if Russia hadn't mobilized so quickly, if Britain had stayed out, maybe the war could have been avoided. But in 914, no one was backing down. Pride, fear, and a belief in quick victory drove them forward. By August 1914, the guns were firing, the armies were marching, and the world was plunging into the bloodiest conflict it had ever seen. No one could have imagined the trenches, the gas attacks, the millions of dead. At that moment, all they knew was that war had come, and nothing would ever be the same again. What happened next? With declarations of war flying across Europe, armies mobilized in the millions. Germany rushed toward France, Russia marched into East Prussia, and Britain sent its forces across the Channel. The first battles would soon prove that this war wouldn't be quick or glorious. It would be a grinding, brutal slaughter. The war machines roll out. A stalemate begins. By August 1914, Europe was a continent in motion. Trains packed with soldiers rumbled toward borders. Crowds cheered as young men marched off to war, and generals pored over maps convinced their brilliant strategies would bring swift victory. Everyone believed this would be a short, decisive fight, over by Christmas, they said. But reality was about to deliver a brutal wake-up call, Germany's gamble. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany had a problem. If war broke out, they'd be stuck fighting France in the west and Russia in the east. A nightmare scenario. So, years earlier, a German general named Alfred von Schlieffen had come up with a plan. Knock out France first, then turn east to deal with Russia. The idea was to sweep through neutral Belgium, outflank the French army, and capture Paris in just 6 weeks. There was just one flaw in this plan. Belgium wasn't going to roll over, and neither were the French. The invasion of Belgium, a scrap of paper. When German troops crossed into Belgium on August 4th, they expected little resistance. Instead, they ran into forts, stubborn Belgian soldiers, and unexpected delays. The Belgians, though hopelessly outnumbered, fought back fiercely. The Germans, frustrated, responded with brutal force, burning towns, executing civilians, and creating a wave of refugees. News of these atrocities shocked the world, especially Britain, which had sworn to protect Belgian neutrality. Germany's chancellor infamously dismissed Belgium's neutrality treaty as a scrap of paper, a phrase that would haunt Germany in propaganda for years. France's plan: attack at all costs. Meanwhile, France had its own strategy, Plan Sévigné. Instead of digging in defensively, the French believed in the power of the offensive, charging forward with bayonets fueled by patriotic fury. They wore bright red pants, marched in tight formations, and trusted in elan, fighting spirit, to carry the day. It didn't work. German machine guns mowed down French troops by the thousands. The French army suffered staggering losses in the opening weeks, learning the hard way that 19th century tactics didn't stand a chance against 20th century firepower. The miracle of the Marne. By early September, the Germans were closing in on Paris. The French government fled, and panic spread. But then, something unexpected happened. The French and British forces, battered but not broken, launched a desperate counterattack along the Marne River. For days, both sides threw everything they had into the battle. At one point, the French even commandeered Parisian taxis to rush troops to the front. The first ever motorized troop transport in war. The Germans, exhausted and overstretched, were forced to retreat. The First Battle of the Marne, September 6-12, 1914, was a turning point. Paris was saved, and Germany's dream of a quick victory died right there in the mud. The Eastern Front. Russia. Surprises, then stumbles. While the West was locked in stalemate, the East was a different story. Russia, moving faster than Germany expected, invaded East Prussia. For a moment, it looked like Germany might be crushed between two fronts. But then came the Battle of Tannenberg. August 26-30, 1940. German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff used railroads to outmaneuver the Russians, encircling and destroying an entire army. It was a devastating defeat for Russia, but it also meant Germany couldn't focus all its forces on France. The trenches begin. With the Marne saved and the Schlieffen Plan in ruins, both sides tried to outflank each other in a series of maneuvers called the Race to the Sea. By November, the front stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, and neither side could break through. So they dug in. What started as simple foxholes soon became elaborate networks of trenches, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. The war of movement was over. Now, it was a war of mud, blood, and waiting. The illusion of a short war shatters. By the end of 1914, the truth was sinking in. This wouldn't be over by Christmas. Hundreds of thousands were already dead. The French had lost nearly 300,000 men in the first few months. Germany's quick victory had slipped away. Britain's small professional army was being ground down, and Russia, though massive, was struggling to keep up with modern warfare. The generals still talked about the next big push, but the soldiers in the trenches knew better. This was going to be a long, ugly fight, and no one was ready for what came next. What happened next? Winter settled over the battlefields, bringing freezing rain, flooded trenches, and a grim new reality. Both sides scrambled to adapt. More artillery, better gas masks, deeper bunkers. But one thing was certain. The war had changed. And in the coming months, it would only get worse. Life and death. In the trenches. By early 1915, the Western Front had become a nightmarish scar across Europe, a twisting, muddy labyrinth of trenches stretching over 400 miles from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. The war of movement was long gone. Now, millions of men lived like rats in the earth, clinging to survival between bursts of unimaginable violence. A day in the trenches, imagine. Waking up before dawn, soaked to the bone, your boots sinking into thick, glue-like mud. The air reeks of rotting sandbags, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of old blood. Breakfast, if you're lucky, is stale bread and watery tea. There's no real shelter, just a dugout carved into the trench wall, maybe lined with a rotting plank of wood if you're in a quiet sector. The day's routine never changes. Stand guard, repair collapsing trench walls, haul supplies, dodge sniper fire. At night, work parties crawl into no man's land to mend barbed wire or, if they're really unlucky, retrieve the dead. Sleep comes in short bursts, interrupted by the shriek of artillery or the scuttling of rats the size of cats. The unseen killers, bullets, and shells weren't the only dangers. Trench foot, caused by standing in waterlogged boots for weeks, turned feet into swollen, gangrenous horrors. Lice infested every uniform, spreading typhus and driving men mad with itching. Then there was dysentery, nicknamed the Trots, from filthy water and spoiled food. A soldier might survive a machine gun barrage only to waste away from disease. And then there was the gas. The horror of gas attacks. The first time chlorine gas drifted over Allied trenches at Ypres in April 1915, soldiers thought it was just odd smoke, until their lungs filled with fluid, choking them from the inside. Later came mustard gas, which didn't just kill. It blistered skin, blinded eyes, and left men screaming for days. Gas masks became lifelines, but one cracked seal meant agony. Some men, panicking, tore theirs off and died in the mud. Going over the top. Every few weeks came the order every soldier dreaded. "Over the top, lads!" Whistles blew, ladders went up, and men clambered into no man's land, a wasteland of shell craters, rusted wire, and decomposing corpses. Machine guns mowed them down in waves. Survivors who reached enemy trenches fought with bayonets, clubs, even shovels. Most attacks gained nothing. Some gained 100 yards, at the cost of 10,000 lives, the strange normalcy of war. Amid the horror, soldiers found ways to cope. They traded cigarettes with the enemy during Christmas truces, before officers banned it. They wrote letters home full of lies about fine weather and good food. They adopted trench pets, dogs, cats, even a fox in one Scottish unit. Dark humor flourished. A man might joke about a blighty wound, just serious enough to get him sent home, but not bad enough to cripple him. But the strain wore men down. Some cracked under shell fire, shaking uncontrollably, a condition called shell shock. Officers called it cowardice. Doctors knew better, the war that wouldn't end. By 1916, the trenches had become a grotesque parody of home. Some had names like Piccadilly Circus or Regent Street. Men brewed tea in shell casings, sang music hall tunes, and stared at photos of sweethearts they might never see again. Outside the trenches, generals still plotted grand offensives to break the deadlock. The soldiers knew the truth. This war wasn't about glory anymore. It was about endurance. And no one knew how much longer they could last. What happened next? The generals had a new plan. Throw more men, more shells, more everything at the enemy until something gave. In 1916, two battles would come to define the war's futility, Verdun and the Somme. The war expands, Gallipoli and beyond. By 1915, the Western Front had become a bloody deadlock, with neither side able to break through the tangled mess of trenches. Desperate for a way to turn the tide, Allied leaders hatched a bold new plan: attack the weak underbelly of the Central Powers by striking at the Ottoman Empire. The target? The Dardanelles Strait, a narrow waterway leading straight to Constantinople, the Ottoman capital. Control it, and they could knock the Ottomans out of the war, open a supply line to Russia, and maybe even rally the Balkans against Austria-Hungary. A plan doomed. From the start, the idea sounded good on paper, but execution was another story. British warships tried blasting their way through the strait in March 1915, only to run into underwater mines and devastating Ottoman artillery. With the naval assault stalled, the Allies decided on a full-scale amphibious invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. On April 25th, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops stormed the beaches and walked straight into a nightmare. Ottoman machine gunners dug into the cliffs above, rained down fire. The landing zones became slaughterhouses. Some Anzac, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps soldiers, weighed down by heavy gear, drowned in deep water before even reaching shore. Others clawed their way up rocky slopes, only to find themselves pinned down for months in their own shallow trenches, just yards from the enemy. Stalemate. Under the sun, what followed was a grueling 8-month campaign of heat, disease, and futile attacks. Water was scarce, dysentery rampant, and flies swarmed over the unburied dead. The Ottomans, led by a young officer named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, fought fiercely, refusing to yield an inch. By December, with winter setting in and casualties mounting, the Allies admitted defeat. The evacuation, ironically, was the best executed part of the whole operation. Not a single life was lost as they slipped away under cover of darkness. But the damage was done. 44,000 Allied dead, over 86,000 Ottoman dead, and nothing to show for it. A war that kept growing Gallipoli wasn't the only front expanding in 1915. Italy, lured by promises of land, joined the Allies but got bogged down in brutal mountain fighting against Austria-Hungary. In the Middle East, the British stirred Arab revolts against the Ottomans, while in Africa, colonial troops clashed over remote outposts. The war was no longer just a European conflict. It was a global struggle, swallowing up empires and spitting out chaos. And the worst was yet to come. What happened next? With Gallipoli a disaster, the Allies turned back to the Western Front, where two battles in 1916 would become synonymous with the war's futility: Verdun and the Somme. The Eastern Front. Russia's collapse. While the Western Front was locked in a muddy stalemate, the war in the East was a different beast, a sprawling, chaotic dance of massive armies, sudden advances, and brutal retreats. Russia had thrown millions of men into the fight, but by 1917, the strain was cracking the empire apart. At first, things looked promising. Russian forces steamrolled into Austria-Hungary, sending the Habsburg armies reeling. But Germany struck back hard. At the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, they encircled and annihilated an entire Russian army, turning the tide. For the next 2 years, Russia kept throwing bodies at the problem. Poorly equipped, often unarmed men sent forward in waves, only to be mowed down by German machine guns. Back home, the war was bleeding Russia dry. Factories couldn't keep up, trains broke down, and food shortages sparked riots. By March 1917, the people had had enough. Revolution erupted in Petrograd. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, and a shaky new government took over. But they kept fighting, hoping to prove Russia's strength. Big mistake. Another revolution in November brought the Bolsheviks to power. Led by Lenin, they wanted one thing: peace. In March 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, handing Germany a huge chunk of territory just to end the war. Russia was out. But the fighting had already shattered the empire beyond repair. What happened next? With Russia gone, Germany could finally focus everything on the Western Front. But they weren't the only ones getting reinforcements. America was coming. America joins the fight. For nearly 3 years, the United States had watched Europe tear itself apart from the sidelines. President Woodrow Wilson won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But by early 1917, neutrality was getting harder to justify. Two things finally pushed America into the fight. First, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare. Their U-boats were sinking any ship heading to Britain, including neutral American vessels. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico offering an alliance. If America entered the war, Mexico should attack the U.S. and reclaim lost territories like Texas. When British intelligence leaked it to the press, Americans were furious. On April 2, 1917, Wilson stood before Congress and declared, "The world must be made safe for democracy." 4 days later, the U.S. was at war. But declaring war was one thing. Fighting it was another. America's army was tiny, so a massive draft swept up millions of men. Factories switched to making guns instead of cars. By mid-1918, fresh American troops, nicknamed doughboys, were flooding into France, their energy and supplies giving the exhausted Allies a crucial boost. The tide was turning. Germany's last gamble was about to begin. What happened next? Germany knew time was running out. In early 1918, they launched one final desperate offensive, their last shot at victory before America's full force arrived. Germany's last gamble, the 1918 Spring Offensive. By early 1918, Germany knew it was now or never. With Russia out of the war, they could finally throw everything at the Western Front. But they had to move fast before America's growing army tipped the scales. In March, under General Ludendorff's command, they launched their biggest attack yet, the Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's Battle. At first, it worked terrifyingly well. Stormtroopers, elite German shock troops, smashed through Allied lines using surprise tactics, bypassing strong points and causing chaos. British and French forces reeled backward, losing miles of ground in days. For the first time since 1914, the trenches were breaking open, and Germany seemed close to victory. But momentum is a fickle thing. The German army, exhausted and undersupplied, outran its own reinforcements. Meanwhile, the Allies, now united under French General Ferdinand Foch, started fighting smarter, using coordinated defenses, tanks, and fresh American troops to plug the gaps. By July, the German advance had stalled. They'd taken more land than anyone had in years, but at a terrible cost. Nearly 1 million casualties they couldn't replace. The tide had turned. Now, it was the Allies' turn to attack. What happened next? The Allies launched their counterpunch, the 100 Days Offensive, and this time Germany wouldn't recover. At the final days, armistice at last. By August 1918, the German army was on the ropes. The Allies, now reinforced by endless American troops and tanks, were pushing forward in the 100 Days Offensive, reclaiming territory at a pace no one had seen since 1914. Everywhere, Germany's allies were crumbling. Bulgaria surrendered in September, the Ottomans in October, Austria-Hungary in early November. Back home, Germany was falling apart. The naval blockade had starved the country, and revolution was brewing. Sailors mutinied, workers went on strike, and Kaiser Wilhelm II, realizing he'd lost control, fled to Holland on November 9th. The next day, a new German republic was declared. With no hope left, German leaders begged for peace. At 5:00 a.m. on November 11th, inside a railroad car in France's Compiègne forest, they signed the armistice. The fighting would stop at 11:00 a.m., the famous 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. When the guns finally fell silent, the silence itself was surreal. After 4 years of relentless war, men climbed out of trenches just to stare at a quiet no man's land. Some cheered, some wept, some just sat in exhausted disbelief. The war was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. What happened next? The victors gathered at Versailles to decide Germany's fate, and their decisions would reshape the world. A bitter peace, the Treaty of Versailles. The guns had barely gone silent when the victors gathered in Paris to carve up the post-war world. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was supposed to build a lasting peace, but from the start, it was clear this wouldn't be simple. France wanted revenge. Britain wanted balance. America wanted ideals. And Germany wasn't even invited to the table. The harshest terms came in the Tar Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war, hand over territory, dismantle its military, and pay crushing reparations. A staggering 132 billion gold marks, about 42 billion today. The German delegation was horrified. "This is not peace," one muttered. "It is a 20-year truce." Meanwhile, empires were being redrawn. New nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia rose from the ashes of Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire was carved up, sowing seeds for future conflicts in the Middle East. Woodrow Wilson's dream of a League of Nations took shape, but the U.S. Senate refused to join, weakening it from the start. The treaty left Germany humiliated, its economy in ruins, its people furious. The Allies had won the war, but the peace they made would haunt the world for decades to come. What happened next? The war was over, but its shadow stretched far into the future, reshaping nations, revolutions, and even the next World War. The legacy of the war. World War I didn't just end in 1918. It reshaped the world. Empires fell: Austria-Hungary, Ottoman, Russian. New nations rose. The League of Nations was formed to prevent future wars, but failed. Soldiers came home traumatized. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was widespread. And the harsh peace set the stage for World War II. The war to end all wars didn't, but it changed history forever.